to stand for Parliament?
I think an awful lot of people want to become MPs because they really, really want to do good and they want to help. I mean, so many people are so rude about MPs. I would have a rule that you can't apply to be an MP until you've done 10 years' work in the real world, even if it's only shelf stacking. Just be out there. There are too many MPs now who've never actually worked other than in Parliament or around Parliament, and I think that's not good.
I think in 1997, only two of us had actually come from an authentic working-class background. Clive Efford had been a cab driver, and I'd been a bus driver.
Wow. Is that in the New Labour intake?
I know, in the New Labour, because the other place, they're full of university
lecturers.
lawyers.
It's not right, because you're not
in Poland,
talking.
you cannot actually stand unless you have a university education.
Which is crazy.
Which is the wrong way round, really.
It's absolutely crazy.
Let's pause this here, because there is one man who is pretty proud of the fact that he's not always been in politics. Of course, he worked in business before getting involved in
metals trader.
Not one, but three now political parties, I suppose. Nigel Farage, the GB News presenter and honorary president of Reform UK, joins us now.
Oh, good.
Nigel, thanks for... I don't know if you're still running on American time. I know you've recently got back from the United States, but thank you for being up for us. Frankly, I'm looking at the Reform expectations here. Reform has not done well tonight.
No, it hasn't. And the very simple reason, it mobilised too late. You know, when you call a by-election like this at very short notice, and when there are 24,000 postal votes in the constituency, unless you move incredibly quickly, you are behind the curve. We know that it's a 40% turnout. What we don't yet know is what percentage of that will be postal votes. I bet you it's 60%, maybe even higher. And by the time Simon Danczuk had mobilised his campaign, a local independent candidate had set himself up for the anti-Galloway vote and has clearly done very well. So no, not a great result for Reform, you're quite right. However, a very deeply disturbing, worrying vote for British politics and for our future. And as you well know, Tom, for the last few weeks, I've been saying sectarian politics has arrived. People voting purely on religious lines. I'm told from the count, there were some wards where when the boxes were opened, it was 95% Galloway. And here's the problem. If you have mass postal voting, people get signed up for votes. Literally, they're collected from the door minutes after the postman arrives. It is open to threats. It is open to intimidation. I have tried repeatedly over the last decade and more to say, if we want good election results, if we want to get intimidation out of British politics, we have to go back to postal voting as it was before Tony Blair became PM. This will be a victory for Galloway achieved on the back of postal votes.
That is an extraordinary piece of news that you've brought us, if it turns out to be true, that in some of these boxes it seemed like 95% of the votes were going Galloway. These are North Korean levels of support, Nigel Farage.
When the postman delivers the postal vote, and when somebody's 100 yards behind the postman down the street and knocks on the door and says, I've come to collect your postal vote, they literally say, look, I'm not going to go until I collect it. They physically stand there as somebody puts their cross in the box. This, I'm afraid, is what you get with a combination of postal voting on demand and sectarian politics. And you only had to hear the appalling words of Chris Williamson to realise where we're going. Now, I think as far as this year's election is concerned, Labour will get bitten. They will get bitten by this. Irresponsible immigration policies, divided communities, us being told that we all bow down to the God of diversity. Well, here it is. But the implications going on to 2029, remember, the Muslim population has risen by 44% in the last 10 years. I've seen sectarian voting in Northern Ireland along Protestant and Catholic lines. We are going to have, a serious Islamist force in Parliament by 2029.
That is a profound prediction. I wonder, Nigel, does one risk encouraging that sectarianism by engaging in discussions like this? If it's an Islamist force on this side versus everyone else, is there not a duty, perhaps, on mainstream politicians to reach out to Muslim voters to say there's a way to go past these sectarian lines?
I'd love to think so, Tom, but I said this first after the Bradford West by-election, which I witnessed in 2012. I said then, are we going to see sectarianism in British politics? I saw the Oldham by-election of 2015, where the Guardian's northern correspondent went down a street in Oldham with an interpreter, and she wrote, nobody in the street spoke English. Very few recognised the name Jeremy Corbyn, yet they all said they voted Labour. This is voting along religious lines where the imam has enormous sway over what people do. This has been to Labour's great advantage up until now. It is, I think, in the next few years, going to come back and bite them. And of course, I don't welcome this. I think it's a catastrophe. I think a by-election campaign that we've just seen, in which Simon Danczuk was threatened with a bullet in the head, where a local woman running a burger van who'd put up a Danczuk poster was told they burned the van down. I mean, this is very, very frightening. And just think about the words of Chris Williamson. Just think about the appalling, I think, comparison that he drew between Gaza and Auschwitz, and realise, I'm sorry, folks, this is here to stay.
It is, as you say, an appalling comparison, and one that, frankly, terminated our interview with him. But Nigel, going back to where Reform is, a party you're honorary president of, there are votes in this seat that are going to people who aren't George Galloway, but it seems like perhaps the anti-Galloway, anti-establishment vote seems to be coalescing around a guy called David Tully, an independent candidate. Should Reform have selected a different candidate? Was the fact that the candidate Reform selected was a former Labour MP who had to leave in not the best circumstances after a scandal involving texts sent to a 17-year-old girl? Was that a bad move for the Reform Party? Was that a bad candidate selection?
It's possible that that's a factor, but the real factor is they were too late. I repeat, they were too late. Once those postal votes... I mean, don't forget, this by-election ended 2 weeks ago. This was over 2 weeks ago because of the weight of postal votes. And Danczuk came to this by-election, this very short, quick by-election, relatively late. That was the biggest problem. Plus, Reform's problem is that it can fight an air war in a general election. It doesn't really have the troops and the organisation yet to fight a by-election on the ground effectively.
And this is a very interesting conversation. We were talking with Jacob Rees-Mogg a moment ago about the fact that by-elections don't generally get the attention in the broadcast media that general elections do because of the restrictions placed upon by-election reporting, the restrictions on talking about candidates, the tiptoeing around that all broadcasters must do due to the regulations that we operate under. Is there a case for liberalising those regulations during by-elections, during the Purdah period, in order to examine exactly what's going on?
There is perhaps a case for it. I mean, I have to say, I've been deeply frustrated over the course of the last week, not being able on my show on GB News to give reports of what I've been hearing directly from friends on the ground. But remember, by-elections they're like massive artillery wars. People pile in huge numbers of troops on both sides, and houses sometimes get 20 or 30 leaflets during a by-election. I can remember going back as UKIP leader, well-fought by-elections and the candidate gets 6 or 8%, and then a paper candidate in a general election in the same seat gets 16% or 18%. So by-elections are very, very different. It's clear that a local businessman who's popular and well-known has got the anti-Galloway vote, and that's interesting. But frankly, nobody really is going to be analysing the score that the Conservatives, the Lib Dems or Reform got. What we need to think about are the implications of what Galloway's done. And I would urge this Conservative government, as I've been doing ever since 2010, and I've spoken to Boris Johnson and all of them, I would urge them, please think about the integrity of elections. Please stop mass postal voting. Let's have a system like France, a system like we used to have, where you get a postal vote if you apply for one. You have to have a reason. You're out of the country. You're 97 in a wheelchair. And where postal votes would be about 2 to 2.5% of the overall turnout, and then make people turn up on the day at the polling station with valid ID. And that way we will get less abuse. You know, in 2019 in Peterborough, and the Brexit Party were neck and neck with Labour. On the day of the poll, somebody walked in to a central wall polling station in Peterborough with a Tesco's bag with 1,000 votes in it. That sort of thing simply has to stop. And if we want to stop Galloway, we want to stop extremism, and maybe we can't, but we should at least go back to having sensible voting patterns and end this idea that postal voting is a good idea because it's convenient.
It's fascinating hearing you talking about this, but there will be some who say that limiting the reasons for getting a postal vote is simply an act of voter suppression. It will lead to fewer people engaging in our democracy. What do you say to those challenges?
It'll lead to fewer people being intimidated on their doorsteps. It'll lead to fewer women in certain communities being signed up for a vote and never even seeing the ballot paper. And it'll also mean that we vote on the same day with the same level of knowledge about a campaign and the arguments that have played out. You know, the idea, as I say, that this by-election was over 2 weeks ago, frankly, makes the whole thing a farce.
No, it's a fascinating issue. Nigel, just looking at the figure that George Galloway is, some people might say he's a powerful orator. He's one of these larger-than-life characters. Does the House of Commons need more people like that? Because I remember sitting next to you here at this desk at the last by-election. You had some pretty choice words for people that were elected for the Labour Party who you described as perhaps not the greatest orators in the world. What Westminster will certainly face is a force on the green benches now.
No, I mean, the last couple that won were absolute muppets, weren't they? I mean, they could barely string a sentence together. And that was reading it off a piece of paper. George Galloway, do you know something? I think George is perhaps the best orator I've ever heard. And during the referendum campaign, you know, George and I did work together. And it was really notable that Bradford, a city with a huge Muslim population, voted no, voted to leave. So George is enormously powerful, very charismatic, and even though I disagree with him profoundly on things, on a one-to-one basis, I struggle not to like him. But I'm afraid he is now using that power, that ability, that personality in a way that will divide our country horrendously. Now, I'm old enough, Tom, to remember what sectarian politics looked like in Northern Ireland, and I now fear it's come to England.